A homeless Omega slipped through the Alpha King's fortress gates and saw the paralyzed prince sitting in shadow, his face frozen in grief. Then he did something no wolf dared. He began to dance, not for mercy, not for survival, but simply to make the broken air smile. What happened next would shatter a kingdom's iron laws forever. Kratos Drakon was the most feared alpha in the northern territories. His empire stretched across 7 conquered packs, each one brought to heel through blood and iron. They called him the Iron Fang, a name whispered in terror from the coastal cliffs to the mountain borders. His fortress rose from black obsidian stone, its walls thick enough to withstand siege, its towers sharp as fangs against the sky. Inside those walls, silence ruled. Servants moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their voices never rising above a whisper. The throne room echoed with the memory of screams from wolves who had dared to challenge his authority. His laws were absolute, his judgment was final, and among all his decrees, none was enforced more ruthlessly than the Omega persecution laws. No Omega could approach royalty. No Omega could enter sacred spaces. No Omega could stand in the presence of the Alpha King without invitation. The penalty for violation was death, swift and public. Yet behind the fortress walls, behind the reputation and the fear, Kratos Drakon carried a failure that wealth and power could not fix. It was not the failure of conquest or the weakness of mercy. It was the silence of a son whose laughter he longed to hear again. Theron was 8 years old. Once he had been bright and wild, racing through the fortress corridors with his wooden sword held high, declaring himself a warrior prince who would conquer kingdoms greater than his father's. Once, his laughter had filled the dining hall during evening meals, his questions endless, his curiosity boundless. He had his mother's eyes, soft and grey like morning mist, and his father's strength, evident even in his small frame. But that child was gone now. The boy who sat motionless in the silver wheelchair, staring at nothing, bore only the shell of who Theron had been. His face was pale, his hands limp in his lap, his legs covered by a thick wool blanket, despite the summer heat. He had not spoken in 2 years. He had not walked in 2 years. He had not smiled in 2 years. The accident, as the court called it, had happened on a bright afternoon in the central square. Queen Alara, Kratos' mate and Theron's mother, had been accused of treason. The evidence was damning, presented by the Beta Council with cold precision. She had been found communicating with enemy packs, sharing intelligence, plotting rebellion from within. The trial was swift. The judgment was absolute. Execution by beheading, public and ceremonial, to remind the kingdom that no one stood above the law, not even the queen. Kratos had not wanted Theron to watch. He had ordered the boy confined to his chambers, guarded and protected from the horror about to unfold. But Theron had slipped away from his nursemaid, climbed the eastern tower, and pressed his small face against the window. He had watched as his mother was led to the platform in chains. He had watched as she knelt before the executioner. He had watched as the blade fell. And then he had collapsed. The royal healers found no injury. His bones were intact, his spine undamaged, his muscles healthy. But Theron could not move his legs. He could not stand. He could not walk. The head healer, an ancient wolf named Corvus, with silver fur and milky eyes, had delivered the diagnosis with grim certainty. The paralysis was not of the body. It was of the mind. Trauma had locked Theron's spirit so tightly that his body refused to obey. Guilt, grief, and shock had bound him more completely than any chain. Kratos had tried everything. He summoned bone healers from the southern deserts, shamans who claimed to speak with ancestral spirits. He brought mind witches from the eastern forests, crones who brewed potions meant to unlock frozen thoughts. He even sent emissaries to the northern mountains, seeking the reclusive mystics who lived in ice caves and spoke in riddles. Every healer examined Theron. Every mystic performed their rituals. Every potion was administered with hope and desperation. And every attempt ended in the same crushing disappointment. Theron remained silent. Theron remained still. The light in his grey eyes remained dim. The fortress became a tomb. Meals were eaten in silence. Servants spoke only when necessary. Kratos threw himself into governance, signing decrees and hearing petitions with mechanical efficiency, but his heart was not in it. At night, he stood at the window of his private chambers, staring down at the garden where Theron was sometimes wheeled for fresh air. He watched his son sit motionless under the oak tree, unresponsive to birdsong or sunlight, or the gentle words of his caretakers. And Kratos felt something he had not felt in decades: helplessness. He was an alpha king. He commanded armies. He crushed rebellions. He bent entire territories to his will. But he could not heal his own child. Power, he was learning, had limits, and those limits were breaking him. One hot afternoon, the kind where the sun pressed down like a weight, and even the shade offered little relief, Theron was wheeled into the garden by a young servant named Mira. She was gentle with him, always speaking softly, even though he never answered. She positioned his wheelchair beneath the oak tree, adjusted the blanket over his legs, and placed a cup of water within reach on the small table beside him. Then she stepped back, standing at a respectful distance, her eyes filled with quiet sadness. Theron stared ahead, his gaze fixed on the iron gate at the far end of the garden. Beyond it lay the outer courtyard, and beyond that, the world he no longer belonged to. He did not notice the movement at first. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the grey fog that had become his constant companion. But then something flickered at the edge of his vision. A shadow, quick and small, darting along the base of the stone wall. His eyes shifted slightly. There, near the hedge that lined the eastern side of the garden, a section of the wall had crumbled. It was a small gap, barely wide enough for a child, hidden by overgrown vines. And through that gap, a boy slipped inside. The boy was barefoot, his feet dirty and calloused from walking on rough ground. His clothes were little more than rags. A torn shirt that hung loosely from his thin shoulders and shorts that were far too large, held up by a frayed piece of rope tied around his waist. His hair was wild and tangled, dark curls falling into his eyes. His knees were bruised, his arms scratched, his skin marked by the harshness of survival. But when he straightened and looked around the garden, his eyes were bright. Not with fear, not with submission, but with something that looked almost like mischief. He saw Theron. For a moment he froze, his body tense as if ready to run. Then his head tilted slightly, and he studied the boy in the wheelchair with an intensity that felt almost invasive. Theron stared back, his expression blank, his body still. The stranger took a cautious step forward, then another. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent their life dodging danger, light on his feet, silent as a breath. When he was close enough to see Theron's face clearly, he stopped. And then, without warning, without explanation, he began to dance. It was not the kind of dance performed in royal courts. There were no precise steps, no elegant gestures, no formal patterns. It was wild and exaggerated, full of spins and leaps that defied gravity. The boy flung his arms wide, twirled in a circle, and stumbled dramatically, as if he had tripped over his own feet. He caught himself with theatrical flair, throwing his hands up in mock surprise. His movements were absurd, ridiculous even, but there was joy in them, pure, unfiltered joy. Theron blinked. It was the first time in months that something had broken through the fog. The boy spun again, faster this time, his arms windmilling as he pretended to lose balance. He hopped on one foot, flailed wildly, and then struck a pose as if he had just accomplished something magnificent. And then, impossibly, Theron's lips twitched. It was the smallest movement, barely visible, but it was there. The corner of his mouth lifted, and then, like a crack in a frozen lake, a sound escaped him. A giggle, soft and hesitant, as if he had forgotten how to make it. The boy's eyes lit up. He grinned, wide and unrestrained, and danced harder. He spun in wild circles, leapt into the air, landed with exaggerated stomps that made no sound on the soft grass. He made his eyes comically wide, puffed out his cheeks, and wobbled like a drunkard. And Theron laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not restrained or careful. It was loud and bright and utterly uncontrolled, the kind of laughter that came from deep in the chest and refused to be contained. It echoed across the garden, bouncing off the stone walls, reaching the fortress itself. Mira gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had never heard the prince laugh, not once in the 2 years she had served him. Theron clapped his hands together, the movement jerky and unpracticed, but real. The boy bowed dramatically, then cartwheeled across the grass. Theron laughed again, louder this time, his whole body shaking with it. And then the alarm bells rang. Guards poured into the garden from every entrance, their weapons drawn, their faces hard. Mira shouted for them to stop, but they did not listen. The boy's head snapped up. He looked at Theron one last time, his grin fading into something softer, something almost sad. Then he turned and ran. He moved like water, slipping between the guards before they could grab him, darting toward the gap in the wall. Within seconds, he was gone, vanished into the shadows beyond the hedge. The guards searched the perimeter, shouting orders, but the boy had disappeared. Mira knelt beside Theron, her hands trembling as she checked him for injury. But Theron was smiling. For the first time in 2 years, his face was bright, his eyes alive. He was still smiling when the head of the guard arrived, demanding to know what had happened. He was still smiling when the servants gathered, whispering in shock and confusion. And from the tower window above, Kratos Dracon stood frozen, his hand gripping the stone ledge so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had been reviewing reports when the laughter reached him. At first, he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, unmistakable and real. He had run to the window and looked down, just in time to see the ragged boy dancing, just in time to see his son laughing. And now, as the guards searched and the servants fussed, Kratos remained still, his mind racing. His son had laughed. A homeless Omega had slipped through his defenses, broken every law, and made his son laugh. Fury surged through him, hot and instinctive. How had security failed so completely? How had an intruder penetrated the fortress? But beneath the fury, something else stirred, something he had not felt in years. Hope. Kratos turned from the window and walked to his desk. He picked up the communication crystal and spoke a single command. Find him. But do not harm him. The captain of the guard responded immediately. confusion evident in his tone. "My king, the Omega violated the sacred grounds. The law demands execution." Kratos's voice was cold and absolute. "I said find him. Bring him to me alive. Do you understand?" "Yes, my king." The crystal went dark. Kratos sat down slowly, his hands folded on the desk before him. For the first time in 2 years, his son had laughed. And the boy who had made it happen was an Omega, homeless, unlawful, and now the only source of light in Theron's darkness. Kratos closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. The Iron Fang, the Alpha King who ruled through fear and absolute law, had just given an order that contradicted everything he stood for. And he did not care, because in that moment, watching his son smile, he had realized something that terrified him more than any enemy ever could. He would break every law he had written if it meant hearing that laughter again. The boy's name was Lysander, though no one in the fortress knew it yet. He had not always been homeless. 5 years ago, he had belonged to a pack called Silvermere, a territory nestled in the valley where the river split into 3 branches, and wildflowers grew thick as carpets in the spring. It had been a peaceful place, known for its artists and dancers, its weavers and storytellers. The Silvermere wolves did not seek conquest. They sought beauty, and Lysander, even as a child, had been trained in their oldest tradition, dance. He had learned the movements from his grandmother, a woman with silver hair braided with ribbons, who moved like water even in her old age. She taught him that dance was not performance. It was communication. It was prayer. It was the language spoken when words failed. Lysander had danced at every festival, every celebration, every gathering of the pack. He had danced when new pups were born. He had danced when mates were bonded. And he had danced at the final great feast before everything ended. Queen Alara had been there that night. She had come to Silvermere as a guest, escaping the rigid formality of the fortress for a few stolen days of freedom. Lysander remembered her clearly. She had worn a simple dress, not the heavy gowns of court, and she had laughed as she watched the dancers spin beneath the lanterns. He had been 12 then, young but already skilled, and he had performed a solo piece that told the story of the first wolves, the ones who had run with the moon before packs and territories existed. The queen had applauded. She had smiled at him, and beside her, holding her hand, had been a small boy with grey eyes. Theron. Lysander had not known their names then. He had only known that the woman was kind and the boy was curious, asking questions about every movement, every gesture. 2 weeks later, Silvermere was gone. Kratos Draken's army had swept through the valley during his expansion campaign, claiming the territory for strategic purposes. The pack had tried to negotiate. They had offered alliance, trade, cooperation. But Kratos did not negotiate with those he considered weak. His forces burned the villages, scattered the survivors, and executed the pack leaders who resisted. Lysander's family died in the fires. His grandmother had pushed him into the river, told him to run and never look back. He had obeyed, and he had been running ever since. For 5 years, he survived on the edges of civilization. He stole food when he had to. He danced in market squares for copper coins. He slept in alleys and under bridges, always moving, never staying long enough to be noticed. The Omega persecution laws made life even harder. Omegas were considered weak, subordinate, unworthy of respect. They were banned from sacred spaces, forbidden from approaching nobility, and punished harshly for any perceived transgression. Lysander learned to hide his scent with mud and ash, to keep his head down, to disappear into crowds. But he never stopped dancing. It was the only thing he had left of home. He did not know why he had come to the fortress that afternoon. Something had pulled him there, a feeling he could not name, a tug in his chest that grew stronger the closer he came to the black walls. He had slipped through the chaos of a supply delivery, guards distracted by wagons and merchants arguing over tariffs. The gap in the garden wall had been pure luck, or perhaps fate. And when he saw the boy in the wheelchair, pale and silent and so utterly broken, Lysander had felt a recognition that went beyond logic. He knew that emptiness. He had lived it. And so he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He danced. He had not expected the laughter. He had not expected the guards. And he certainly had not expected to feel compelled to return. But that night, as he huddled in an abandoned warehouse near the docks, he could not stop thinking about the boy's face, the way his eyes had brightened, the way his whole body had shaken with joy. Lysander had made someone happy. For the first time in 5 years, he had given something instead of just surviving. And it mattered. So the next night, he went back. He waited until the moon was high and the guard patrols were predictable, then slipped through the same gap in the wall. The garden was empty except for the boy, sitting in his wheelchair beneath the oak tree as if he had been waiting. Theron's eyes widened when he saw Lysander emerge from the shadows, and then, slowly, carefully, he smiled. Lysander smiled back. He stepped into the moonlight and began to dance. This time, it was different. He did not dance for laughter. He danced to tell a story. He moved through the ancient patterns his grandmother had taught him, the ones that spoke of hunts and battles, of love and loss, of wolves who ran free under endless skies. His body became the story, each gesture a word, each spin a sentence. Theron watched, his eyes following every movement, his face no longer blank but focused, present. And when Lysander finished, bowing low as tradition demanded, Theron's hand twitched. Just a small movement, fingers curling slightly, but it was there. Lysander returned the next night, and the next, and the next. Each time, he danced a different story. He danced the tale of the first alpha, who had united warring packs through wisdom instead of force. He danced the legend of the moon goddess, who wept silver tears that became the stars. He danced the history of Silvermere, the valley of flowers and peace that no longer existed. And with each dance, Theron responded. His fingers moved more, his head turned to follow the motion. And on the 7th night, he spoke. It was only a whisper, barely audible, but Lysander heard it. Beautiful. From the tower window, Kratos watched every night. He had ordered the guards to stand down, to let the Omega enter unchallenged, though he told no one why. He watched his son come alive, watched the light return to his eyes, watched his body begin to remember how to move. And he watched the dancer, this ragged boy who moved with a grace that seemed impossible given his circumstances. Kratos did not understand it. He did not trust it. But he could not deny the results. His son was healing. The royal healers confirmed it. Corvus, the ancient wolf with silver fur, examined Theron after the first week and found changes that defied explanation. Neural pathways are reactivating, he reported, his milky eyes wide with shock. The emotional breakthrough is triggering physical recovery. Whatever this boy is doing, it is working. Kratos demanded details, but Corvus could only shake his head. It is not medicine, my king. It is not magic. It is connection. The prince's mind is unlocking because he has found a reason to move again. But secrets in the fortress did not remain secret for long. Servants whispered, guards gossiped, and within 2 weeks, the rumors reached the Beta Council. Draken, the king's cousin and head counselor, was a wolf who valued law above all else. He was broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, his fur a darker shade of grey than Kratos's black, and his loyalty to tradition was absolute. When he heard that an Omega had been entering the sacred grounds repeatedly, touching the prince with his presence, he was appalled. He convened an emergency session of the council without the king's knowledge. The council met in the great hall, 7 high-ranking wolves seated around a table carved from a single piece of ironwood. Draken stood at the head, his voice cold and precise. An Omega has been violating our most sacred laws. He has entered the royal garden. He has approached the heir, and the king has allowed it. The other councillors erupted in outrage. How is this possible? Has the king gone mad? The persecution laws exist for a reason. Omegas are weak, corruptible, unworthy of proximity to power. If we allow this, we invite chaos. Draken raised his hand for silence. I have sent guards to capture the Omega. He will be brought before us at dawn. The law is clear. Contamination of the royal bloodline through Omega contact carries only one penalty: death. The council murmured agreement. And the king? One of them asked. What if he objects? Draken's expression hardened. Then we remind him that even a king is not above the law. If he refuses to enforce it, we will question his fitness to rule. That night, guards surrounded the garden. When Lysander slipped through the gap in the wall, they were waiting. He saw them too late. Hands grabbed him from behind, rough and unyielding, slamming him to the ground. He did not fight. He had known this would happen eventually. They bound his wrists with iron chains that burned against his skin, the metal treated with silver to weaken wolves. Theron screamed from his wheelchair, his voice raw and desperate. No! Leave him alone! Please, do not hurt him! But the guards ignored him. They dragged Lysander away as Theron sobbed, his small hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles went white. By dawn, the entire fortress knew. Servants spoke in hushed tones, guards stood at attention, weapons ready. And in the throne room, the council assembled, their faces grim. Lysander was brought in chains, forced to his knees on the cold stone floor. His clothes were even more ragged now, torn during the capture, and his face was bruised where a guard had struck him for struggling. But his eyes were not afraid. They were sad, resigned, as if he had always known this was how his story would end. Theron was carried into the hall by 2 servants, still in his wheelchair, his face streaked with tears. He had refused to stay in his chambers, had screamed and fought until they relented. Now he sat at the edge of the crowd, his small body trembling. Kratos entered last, his expression unreadable, his movements controlled. He took his seat on the throne, his hands resting on the carved armrests, and looked down at the Omega kneeling before him. Draken stepped forward, his voice ringing through the hall. This Omega has violated the sacred laws of our kingdom. He entered royal grounds without permission. He approached the heir without sanction. He contaminated the bloodline with his presence. The law is absolute. The penalty is death. The council demands immediate execution. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to Kratos. He stared at Lysander, his face carved from stone, his amber eyes burning. Lysander stared back, his chin lifted despite the chains, despite the bruises, despite the certainty of death. And then Corvus, the old healer, stepped forward from the crowd. He moved slowly, his joints stiff with age, but his voice was strong. "My king, I must speak." Kratos nodded once. Corvus turned to face the council. "I have examined the prince every day for 2 years. I have watched him fade. I have tried every remedy, every ritual, every treatment known to our kind. Nothing worked. But in the past 2 weeks, I have witnessed a miracle. The prince is moving. He is speaking. His body is healing. And it began the night this Omega danced for him." Draken's face twisted with anger. "That means nothing. Omega influence is corrupting. Whatever temporary improvement we see will fade, and the damage to the prince's purity will be permanent." Corvus shook his head. "There is more. I recognize this boy's movements. I am old enough to remember the dances of Silvermere. He danced at Queen Alara's celebration before her arrest. The prince's mind remembers those movements. It is why he responds. This Omega is a link to the last time Theron felt safe." The hall erupted. "Silvermere? He is from the pack we destroyed. This is blood guilt. He must die for the very crime of his existence." Theron cried out, his voice breaking. "He did not hurt anyone. He helped me. Please, Papa. Please do not kill him." But the council was beyond reason. Draken turned to Kratos, his eyes hard. "You have a choice, my king. Uphold the law and prove your strength, or protect this Omega and prove you are weak. The kingdom is watching." Kratos rose from his throne. The hall fell silent again, the weight of his presence crushing. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat. He stopped in front of Lysander, looking down at the boy who had changed everything. And then, for the first time in years, Kratos felt it. The scent broke through the suppressants he had been taking since Alara's death, the blockers that kept his wolf instincts muted and controllable. Lavender and smoke, wild and pure, the scent of a fated mate. His wolf roared inside him, recognition slamming into his chest like a physical blow. This Omega, this homeless boy from a destroyed pack, was his mate. The bond he had denied, the connection he had buried, surged to life with such intensity that he staggered. Lysander's eyes widened. He felt it too. The pull, the certainty, the inevitability. Kratos turned to the council, his voice low and dangerous. Council adjourned. "I will render judgment at dawn." Draken opened his mouth to protest. But Kratos' alpha command rolled through the hall like thunder. "Leave, now." The council filed out, their faces tight with fury. The servants followed, the guards remained at their posts, but their eyes were uncertain. Only Theron stayed, still crying softly, his hands reaching toward Lysander. Kratos gestured to the guards. "Take the Omega to the lower cells. Do not harm him further, and bring my son to his chambers." Lysander was dragged away, his eyes locked on Kratos until the doors closed behind him. Theron sobbed as the servants carried him out, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Papa, please, please do not kill him." Kratos stood alone in the throne room, his hands clenched into fists, his mind at war with itself. He had built his empire on law, on strength, on the absolute belief that power was the only truth that mattered. And now he stood at the edge of a choice that would destroy everything he had created, or everything he had left to love. That night, Kratos descended into the dungeons. The cells were carved into the stone beneath the fortress, cold and damp, and lit only by torches that flickered in the draught. Lysander sat on the floor of the furthest cell, his back against the wall, his wrists still bound. He looked up when Kratos approached, his expression weary but calm. The king stood outside the bars, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough. "You are from Silvermere." Lysander nodded. "You killed my pack. You burned my home. You took everything from me." Kratos's jaw tightened. "Then why did you come here? Why did you dance for my son?" Lysander looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, only sorrow. "Because he needed joy. And I know what it is like to be broken. I know what it is like to live in silence and grief. I would not wish that on anyone, not even the son of the wolf who destroyed my world." Kratos stepped closer to the bars. The bond thrummed between them, undeniable and painful. "You knew discovery would mean death." Lysander smiled faintly. "I have been dead for 5 years. I have only been surviving. But when I saw him laugh, when I saw him move, I felt alive again, even if only for a moment. That was worth dying for." Kratos closed his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a physical burden. "I cannot save you without destroying everything I have built. The council will never accept it. Half the kingdom will rebel. My own laws will turn against me." Lysander met his gaze steadily. "Then do not save me. But let me see him one more time. Let me dance for him once more before you carry out the sentence. Give him that, at least." Kratos turned away, his hands gripping the stone wall. His wolf howled inside him, desperate and enraged. This was his mate, the one wolf in all the world meant for him, and the law he had written demanded that mate's death. He stood there for a long time, silent and still, while Lysander waited in the cell behind him. Finally, Kratos spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will give you my answer at dawn." Dawn came too quickly, the public square filled with wolves from every corner of the fortress and beyond. Word had spread through the night. The king would pass judgment on the Omega who had dared to touch the prince. It would be a spectacle, a reminder of the law's power, a reaffirmation of order. The execution platform stood in the center of the square, wooden and stark, stained dark from previous use. Guards lined the perimeter, their faces hard. The council stood on a raised dais, watching with cold satisfaction. Lysander was brought out in chains, his hands bound in front of him, his feet bare against the cold stone. He walked with his head high, his steps steady, as if he were walking to a dance instead of a death. The crowd murmured, some in anger, some in pity. He was led to the platform and forced to kneel. The executioner, a massive wolf with a hooded face, stood beside him with an axe resting on his shoulder. Then the servants brought Theron. He was still in his wheelchair, his face pale and tear-streaked, his small hands gripping the armrests. They positioned him at the front of the crowd, where he could see everything. He looked at Lysander, and Lysander looked back. The boy smiled, just a little, as if to say it would be all right. Theron shook his head, his lips forming silent words. "No, please." Kratos entered the square last. He wore his full ceremonial armor, black plate etched with silver, a cloak of wolf fur draped over his shoulders. The crown of iron thorns sat heavy on his head. He walked to the dais and stood before his people, his face a mask of control. The crowd fell silent. Drakon stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. "The Omega has been judged. The law demands his death. Do you, as Alpha King, uphold the law?" Kratos looked at Lysander. He looked at his son. He looked at the crowd, at the council, at the kingdom he had built felt with blood and fear. And then he removed his crown. The gesture was so unexpected that gasps rippled through the crowd. He placed the crown on the stone ground at his feet and stepped away from it. "I am Alpha King by conquest," he said, his voice ringing clear and strong. "I wrote the laws of this kingdom in blood. I ruled through fear and iron. I believed that power was the only truth that mattered. But I was wrong." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Draken's face went white with fury. Kratos continued, his eyes on Theron. "My son has been paralyzed for 2 years. I brought him the best healers. I spent fortunes on treatments. I used every resource at my command. And nothing worked. He was dying inside, fading a little more each day. I could not save him. But this Omega did. This homeless boy, with nothing but joy and movement, gave my son back his life." He turned to face the council. The Omega persecution laws were written to protect power, but they do not protect life. They do not protect love. They do not protect the things that truly matter. And I will not enforce a law that demands I kill the one who healed my child. Drakon stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage. "You would break your own laws. You would choose an Omega over the kingdom?" Kratos met his gaze without flinching. "I choose my son, and I choose to redefine what strength means." He walked to the platform, his steps deliberate, the guards tensed, uncertain. Kratos reached Lysander and knelt beside him. He took the Omega's bound hands in his own and looked into his eyes. "You are my fated mate. I have denied it. I have fought it. But I cannot deny it any longer, and I will not let you die." He bit down on the chains, his wolf strength snapping the silver links. Then he pulled Lysander to his feet and turned to face the crowd. "The Omega persecution laws are abolished," he declared, his voice carrying across the square like a command. "Effective immediately. Any wolf who harms an Omega will answer to me. And this Omega, Lysander of Silvermere, I claim as my consort and mate." He pulled Lysander close and bit down on his neck, the mating mark searing into place, the bond snapping into completion with such force that both of them gasped. The crowd exploded into chaos, half roared in fury, half stood in stunned silence. The council shouted protests, but Kratos ignored them. Drakon drew his sword. "If you will not uphold the law, then you are unfit to rule. I challenge you for the throne, trial by combat, now." Kratos released Lysander and turned to face his cousin, his eyes blazing gold. "So be it. But know this. I will not lose, because I am no longer fighting for power. I am fighting for love, and that makes me stronger than I have ever been." The two wolves shifted, their bodies rippling into their true forms. Kratos was massive, his fur black as midnight, his eyes burning amber. Drakon was nearly as large, his grey fur bristling, his teeth bared. They circled each other in the square, the crowd pressing back to give them room. And then they collided. The fight was brutal and swift. Drakon fought with precision and rage, but Kratos fought with purpose. Every strike was measured, every move was deliberate. He was not trying to kill, he was trying to prove. And when Drakon lunged for his throat, Kratos caught him mid-air, slammed him to the ground and pinned him with a paw on his chest. "Submit," Kratos growled, his voice resonating through the bond that connected all wolves. Drakon struggled, but Kratos' alpha command was absolute: submit or die. Drakon's wolf went limp. He shifted back to human form, breathing hard, his eyes filled with hatred. I submit. Kratos released him and shifted back as well, standing naked and unashamed before the crowd. He looked at the council, at the guards, at every wolf who had gathered. Does anyone else wish to challenge me? Silence. He nodded once. Then it is done. He walked back to Lysander and pulled him into his arms. Theron, forgotten in the chaos, suddenly moved. His hands gripped the wheelchair arms. His legs trembled. And then, with a strength born of desperation and love, he pushed himself upright. He stood, swaying, his legs shaking. The crowd gasped. Theron took one step, then another. He stumbled, nearly fell, but caught himself. He walked across the square, slow and unsteady, until he reached his father and Lysander. He collapsed against Kratos's leg, his small arms wrapping around it, his voice breaking. If you had killed him, you would have killed me too. Kratos knelt, gathering his son and his mate into his arms, holding them both as if they were the only things in the world that mattered. I know, he whispered. I know. The weeks that followed were chaos. Half the council resigned in protest. Several noble families withdrew their support. But others, younger wolves tired of the old ways, stepped forward to fill the gaps. The fortress slowly transformed. Music returned to the halls. Laughter echoed in the corridors. Omega refugees, hearing of the law's abolishment, came seeking asylum. Kratos granted it. Lysander taught Theron the dances of Silvermere, the old stories preserved in movement. Theron grew stronger every day, his legs remembering how to carry him, his voice regaining confidence. And Kratos, the wolf who had ruled through fear, learned what it meant to rule through love. He was not softer, he was not weaker, but he was changed. One evening, as the sun set over the fortress, Kratos stood at the window of his chambers, watching the garden below. Lysander and Theron were dancing together, spinning and laughing beneath the oak tree. The boy who had been paralyzed now moved with grace and joy. The Omega who had been homeless now wore the robes of a royal consort. And the king who had believed only in power now understood that true strength was not in domination. It was in the courage to bend, to change, to choose love even when the cost was everything. Lysander looked up and caught his eye. He smiled, that same bright smile that had broken through the darkness. Kratos smiled back. For the first time in his life, he was not afraid, because he had learned the truth that all wolves eventually discover. A king who cannot bend will break. A king who cannot love will rule only ghosts. And he had chosen to bend. He had chosen love. And in doing so, he had finally become the king his son and his mate deserved.